The morning Eliza Marsh was put out of Harlan Briggs' house, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the girl didn't own a coat. She stood in the hard-packed dirt of the yard and felt the cold move through her flour-sack dress and find her skin without difficulty, the way cold does when there is nothing between it and a body that has already surrendered everything else. The boots on her feet were 2 sizes too large. She had stuffed the toes with torn newspaper 3 weeks ago, when the sole of the right one had begun to separate, and the paper had gone soft and useless, compressed now, into something that felt less like insulation and more like a wet apology with every step she took. In her left hand she held a canvas bag. Everything she owned in the world was in that bag. 2 books she had read so many times the spines had softened to the texture of old cloth. A paring knife with a handle wrapped in electrical tape, her father Silas had salvaged it from a junction box before the typhoid took him. A tin cup with a dent on one side from being dropped on a rock ledge when she was 11. And a photograph of her mother Cora taken in the spring of 1929, 3 years before the world changed, Cora standing in front of a dogwood tree in full bloom, laughing at something outside the frame, her whole face turned toward whatever joy had just arrived. Eliza did not look at the photograph that morning. She didn't need to. She knew every detail of it, the way you know the face of someone you have loved and lost, not by looking, but by the particular ache that lives where the memory does. Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway of the house he had built and owned and controlled for 30 years, with the particular pride of a man who has never once been required to examine where that pride comes from. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, carrying the kind of physical authority that passes in certain communities for wisdom, simply because it takes up space. He owned 3,000 acres of cattle range in Caldwell Hollow, the most productive stretch of highland pasture in that part of eastern Tennessee, and he had owned the loyalty of the valley's residents for long enough that the distinction between loyalty and fear had ceased to matter to him. When Harlan Briggs said a thing, people accepted it. When he pointed a direction, people looked that way. And when he stood in a doorway and told a 15-year-old girl she was worthless, the words landed with the full weight of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. "Girls can't cook," he said. The tobacco juice he put on the kitchen floor was punctuation, not accident. "Girls can't do nothing useful. Your daddy owed me money and I took you on to settle the debt. But you ain't worth the food I put in your belly. Get out." Eliza did not argue. She had learned in the 2 years she had lived under that roof that argument with Harlan Briggs was a kind of arithmetic that always came out the same. The numbers changed, but the answer was always his. She picked up the canvas bag. She walked to the end of the yard. She did not look back at the house, not because she had no feelings about leaving it, but because there was nothing in that direction worth the energy of her eyes. What she did not know, standing at the end of that yard with the cold working through her dress, was that Harlan Briggs had already moved to the telephone on the kitchen wall. Before she had taken 20 steps away from his property, he had the receiver in his hand. Before she had reached the first bend in the road, he was speaking to Vera Dowd, who ran the dry goods store at the bottom of the hollow and who kept track of everyone's business with the systematic thoroughness of a person who has confused information with power. He told Vera that Eliza Marsh had stolen money from his house. He told her the girl had taken silver. He said he wanted people to know what kind of person she was before she got any further down the road. Vera Dowd said she understood, and she did understand. She understood precisely what was being asked of her, and she began doing it before the call was finished. It was November of 1934. The Great Depression had been eating through the country for 5 years with the slow patience of something that knows it has time. In Caldwell Hollow, the eating had been going on longer than that because the hollow had never been prosperous in the way that prosperity gets remembered. The families who had settled this particular crease in the eastern Tennessee highlands had come here because the land was cheap and the soil was thin, and nobody else had wanted it badly enough to fight for it. They had scratched out lives from the rocky hillside farms with a combination of stubbornness and low expectations, and they had been doing it for long enough that the stubbornness had become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. The Depression had not introduced suffering to Caldwell Hollow. It had simply removed the possibility of pretending the suffering wasn't there. Eliza walked south first toward the town, because south was where the road went, and the road was what she knew. She had $2.30 in the canvas bag, money she had saved from the occasional work Briggs had allowed her to do for neighboring families, Nickels and dimes accumulated over 18 months in a small cloth pouch at the bottom of the bag beneath the books. She thought she might buy food. She thought she might find someone who would give her work. She was wrong on both counts, and she discovered this within the hour. The first door she knocked on belonged to the Cutter family, who had bought feed from Briggs for years and owed him money they hadn't been able to repay. Mrs. Cutter opened the door 4 inches, looked at Eliza, and said she had nothing for her. The second door belonged to the general store, where a man named Potts looked at her from behind the counter with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, a careful blankness, the kind people produce when they have been told something and have decided to believe it. He said he didn't extend credit to strangers. She told him she wasn't asking for credit. She had money. He said the store was closing early. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. By the time Eliza had tried 4 more doors and received 4 more versions of the same careful nothing, she understood what had happened. The story had moved faster than she had. It had traveled by telephone and by neighbor and by the particular efficiency of small communities where information is currency, and Harlan Briggs was the wealthiest man in the room. She stood on the main road of Caldwell Hollow and looked south where the road continued toward town, and she understood that south was finished. South was the story running ahead of her, like water finding its level pooling in every conversation before she could arrive to correct it. East was Briggs's land. West was Briggs's land. 3,000 acres of cattle range patrolled by men who worked for a man whose word had just made her into something the community would not receive. She looked north. North was Smoky Ridge, rising steep and wild above the hollow, covered in second-growth oak and hickory, and the occasional stand of hemlock inhabited primarily by deer, and the particular silence that belongs to mountains that have not been asked to produce anything. There was no road north. There was no destination north that she knew of. But north was the only direction that didn't belong to Harlan Briggs. She turned north and began to walk. She had been 8 years old when her father, Silas Marsh, first showed her how to read a hillside. Silas was not from Caldwell Hollow. He had come from a small college town in Virginia where he had taught secondary school science for 11 years before the school's funding collapsed and took the position with it. He had brought his wife Cora and his young daughter to Tennessee because a cousin had written that there was work and land to be had, and by the time Silas discovered the cousin had been optimistic by a considerable margin, the family was already there and the money was already gone. He had adapted. He was the kind of man who adapts not by lowering his expectations, but by applying his full attention to whatever the situation in front of him actually requires, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. In Caldwell Hollow, what the situation required was an understanding of the land itself. Silas had spent his adult life teaching biology and earth science to students who were largely indifferent to both, but the knowledge had gone in and stayed, and in the Tennessee mountains it found its purpose. He learned which plants grew where and why. He learned the geology of the limestone ridges, the chemistry of the creek water, the behavior of local weather systems as they pushed through the gaps in the Smoky Ridge. He filled 2 composition notebooks with observations and sketches, and on winter evenings he read to Eliza from his textbooks the way other fathers read fairy tales, because he believed with the particular conviction of a man who had spent his career trying to make knowledge feel real to young people that the best gift he could give his daughter was the habit of understanding why things worked the way they worked. "The deer know something we don't," he told her once when she was 10, crouched beside him on a hillside watching a game trail wind through a stand of bare-limbed hickory. "They know the most efficient path through rough terrain. Follow what they know." She had filed this away with everything else he taught her under the general heading of knowledge that might someday matter. Cora Marsh had her own curriculum. She was, by any honest accounting, the finest cook in 3 counties, and she understood cooking not as a domestic chore, but as applied science carried out in the service of nourishment and pleasure. She could explain in terms Eliza could follow by the time she was 9 why salt draws moisture from meat and concentrates flavor, why vinegar makes pastry crust flaky by interfering with gluten development, why a proper stock requires a low simmer rather than a rolling boil, and what happens to the proteins if you push it too hard. She kept a sourdough starter that she had been maintaining for 2 years, feeding it with patient regularity, as though it were a member of the household, which in some practical sense it was. She taught Eliza to bake bread before Eliza was tall enough to knead dough without standing on a step stool, and she taught her to think about the bread while she made it. Not just to follow steps, but to understand what each step was doing and why. The yeast is alive, Cora told her once, holding Eliza's small hands against the surface of a rising dough so she could feel the subtle movement beneath the skin of it. It's eating and breathing and producing the mass that makes the bread rise. You're not just mixing ingredients, you're managing a living thing. Eliza was 7 years old. She understood completely. The typhoid came through the valley in the autumn of 1932 in the way that disease comes through places where clean water is not guaranteed, which is to say, efficiently and without sentiment. It took Silas first on a Tuesday in late September. It took Cora 8 days later. Eliza was 13 years old. She had held her mother's hand through the fever and done everything she knew how to do, and a few things she invented on the spot from the principles her parents had given her, and none of it had been enough. And afterwards, she had sat in the kitchen of their small cabin for a long time without moving, looking at the sourdough starter on the counter in its crockery jar, still alive, still rising slightly in the September warmth, tended by no one. She fed it. She didn't make a decision about feeding it. Her hands simply knew it needed to be done, and so they did it the same way. Breathing is not a decision. She mixed the flour and the water in the proportions Cora had taught her, stirred it in, covered the jar, and set it back on the counter in the spot where it had always lived. She would not understand until much later what that small automatic act meant. But the understanding, when it came, would confirm something that had already been true since she was 13 years old, standing alone in her mother's kitchen, that keeping living things alive was not just something she did. It was what she was. The climb up Smoky Ridge took most of the day. She followed deer trails because her father had told her to, and because he had been right about most things, and because the trails wound upward through stands of bare-limbed hardwoods, with the efficiency of long practice, switching back on the steeper pitches, leveling briefly on the narrow benches before ascending again. The leaves were down and brown in the November cold, the ground frozen in the open spots and still soft where the canopy had held enough warmth. The air thinned as she climbed. The temperature dropped. By mid-afternoon, she was shaking. Not the ordinary shivering of a person who is cold and knows it will pass, but the deeper systemic trembling that happens when cold has moved past the body's defenses and begun working on the machinery itself. Her thoughts were becoming slippery. Simple decisions felt complicated. She knew in the part of her mind that was still functioning clearly that this was dangerous. She knew what hypothermia was. Her father had described it precisely, including the specific cognitive impairment it produced and why the blood retreating from the extremities and the brain to protect the core, leaving the outer systems to manage with reduced resources. She also knew that knowing what was happening to her was not the same as being able to stop it. She almost didn't see the cave. It was set back from a narrow creek half hidden behind a curtain of dead Virginia creeper that had climbed a limestone outcropping and died in place, its dried tendrils still holding the shape of living growth. The opening was roughly 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, cut into the base of a gray limestone cliff that rose another 40 feet above it. The rock above the opening jutted out at an angle, creating a natural overhang that extended 6 feet beyond the entrance, a stone porch that would keep rain and snow from driving directly in. She pushed through the dead creeper and stood in the entrance and looked. The cave went back into the rock farther than she could see in the failing light. The floor was dry, packed earth. The walls were smooth, pale limestone that showed the faint ripple of ancient water. And the air was different from the air outside in a way she registered before she could name it. It was still. And it was warmer. Not warm in any dramatic sense, not the warmth of a fire or a heated room, but warmer than the hillside outside, warmer than the hollow below, holding a temperature that felt constant in a way that deep things feel constant, unhurried by whatever was happening above them. She went in. She went back as far as the failing light allowed and found that the cave narrowed gradually and then opened again into a second, smaller chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet across, with a ceiling that rose to a point at the center. And in that ceiling there was a crack, narrow but clearly open to the sky above, because a faint thread of gray light descended through it, and when Eliza held her hand near the opening, she could feel a faint, steady movement of air. She stood in the second chamber and breathed. She let her body register the temperature, which was the same throughout, held by the limestone on all sides, indifferent to the November cold outside. And then a memory arrived, her father's voice calm and precise. Reading from one of his textbooks on a winter evening, while the fire burned low and Cora's sourdough starter rested on the counter, dense materials absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, buffering against temperature extremes, maintaining their interior at something close to the average annual temperature of the region. He had looked up from the page and added in the way he always added the thing that made abstract knowledge concrete. That's why a cave stays cool in summer and warm in winter, Eliza. The rock remembers the average. It doesn't react to the extremes. She looked at the crack in the ceiling, a vertical shaft open to the sky drawing air upward from below, a natural chimney. If a fire were built in the outer chamber, the smoke would rise through the narrowing passage and exit through that crack drawn up and out by the same convection that was currently moving cool air across her palm. The cold had slowed her thinking, but it had not stopped it. And what she thought standing in that inner chamber, with her hand held near a crack in the limestone ceiling of a cave she had found by accident, while fleeing a man who had called her worthless, what she thought was not, "I am safe," and not, "I will survive," but something more specific than either of those. She thought, this is not a place to hide. This is a place to build. The first 2 weeks were the kind of education that no book adequately describes. Not because the books were wrong. Her father's books were almost never wrong, but because books can only approximate the specific physical reality of sustained hunger and cold operating simultaneously on a body that has no reserves left to draw on. Eliza had reserves of a different kind: the habit of close observation, the practice of reasoning from what she could see to what she could not, and the knowledge that most problems contain within them, if examined carefully enough, the materials for their own solution. She ate what the late-season ridge provided, which was not much, but was not nothing. Dried persimmons still clinging to bare branches, their sugar concentrated by frost to a dark, sticky sweetness. The last of the hickory nuts buried in the leaf litter at the base of the big trees, requiring patient searching on hands and knees in cold that made her fingers clumsy. Watercress in the creek, available year-round in the cold water streams of the Tennessee highlands, tasting clean and slightly sharp. She ate sparingly, systematically, cataloging what she found and where she found it with the same methodical attention her father had applied to everything. She nearly died 3 times in those 2 weeks. The first time was a fall on an icy slope above the cave. During an afternoon when she had pushed herself farther than her current condition warranted trying to reach a stand of hickory she had spotted from a distance. She went down hard on a rock, gashed the outside of her left leg below the knee, and lay in the cold for a moment, assessing the damage with a detached practicality that shock sometimes produces. The gash needed pressure. She had no cloth to spare. She packed it with sphagnum moss from the creek bank, a technique Silas had described in one of his notebooks as having been used by wilderness travelers for generations, the moss having natural antiseptic properties and sufficient absorbency to do the work of a bandage. She walked back to the cave and elevated her leg and did not go out the next day. The wound closed. And she added to her internal catalog, ice on a slope is not negotiable. The body's confidence in its own footing is not always accurate. The second near-death was a night in late November when the temperature outside dropped far enough that the wind finding the cave entrance, despite the natural overhang, brought the interior temperature down to something her body could not manage. She woke at 2 in the morning, shaking so hard she could not control her own limbs. She understood what was happening. She understood it with a clarity that had no emotion in it, which is a different thing from courage, but is sometimes confused with it. She piled every piece of dried vegetation she had gathered against the back wall of the inner chamber and burrowed into it and pulled it over herself and held absolutely still and focused on the single physical task of generating heat from a body that had very little heat left to generate. By 4 in the morning, the shaking had subsided. By dawn, she was cold but stable. She spent the next 2 days building a windbreak at the cave entrance, branches and deadfall arranged in a configuration that reduced the airflow without eliminating ventilation, because a cave with no ventilation and a fire in it is a different kind of problem, and she was already thinking ahead to the fire she would need. The third near-death was the quietest and in some ways the most instructive. She had found a section of the creek where the water ran clear and cold over flat stones, and she had been drinking from it for several days before she noticed one afternoon while following the stream uphill that there was something dead in the water about a quarter mile above her usual drinking spot. A deer or what remained of one wedged against a deadfall in the middle of the current. She had been drinking downstream of a decomposing carcass for an unknown number of days. 2 days after making this discovery, she was unable to stand without the world tilting sideways. She lay on the cave floor with stomach cramps severe enough that she could not eat drinking water from a portion of the creek she had identified as being above the obstruction, accessing it by a route that did not require standing fully upright. She waited. 2 days later, she could stand again. She found the specific memory of her father's description of waterborne pathogen transmission, ran it against what had happened, and confirmed the diagnosis. And after that, she filtered every drop of water she drank through a system she built over the following week from a hollow log section, layered creek sand, and charcoal from her first experimental fires. On the worst nights, Eliza talked to her mother, not in the way of a person who has lost their hold on what is real, but in the way of a person who has identified a practical use for the imagination. She described what she was going to cook. She described it in the specific terms Cora had taught her, not just what ingredients, but what the process would do to each one, how the heat would transform the proteins in the meat, how the acid from wild greens would brighten and lift a broth, how the bread she planned to bake when she had a proper oven would smell in the first 3 minutes after it came out of the heat. Cora's voice came back in these conversations with the texture and authority of lived memory correcting technique, asking questions about quantities, expressing opinions about the relative merits of different wild alliums. It kept Eliza thinking forward. It kept the project alive in her mind during the weeks when the only person she was feeding was herself, and barely that. She studied the cave the way her father had taught her to study anything systematically, beginning with what she could observe directly and moving outward toward inference. The ceiling crack in the inner chamber was the most important feature. She spent 2 full days observing it at different times of day and in different weather conditions before she confirmed what she had suspected. The crack created a reliable upward draft drawing air from the outer chamber through the narrowing passage and up and out into the sky above. The draft was gentle but consistent. It meant that a fire built in the right location in the outer chamber would vent its smoke naturally drawn upward through the inner chamber and out through the crack without filling the cave with it. This was not a small thing. This was the difference between a shelter and a home. The limestone walls added their own dimension. She had read enough of her father's geology notes to know that limestone holds heat, that the dense crystalline structure of the rock absorbs warmth and releases it slowly, so that a stone room is warmer at midnight than at noon, because the heat stored at noon is still radiating at midnight. A fire in the outer chamber combined with the thermal mass of surrounding limestone meant the cave could be maintained at a livable temperature through the night on less fuel than any above-ground structure would require. She tested this with small fires. She observed how long the walls held warmth after the fire died. The results were better than the theory had promised. She built the fire pit from river rocks carried up from the creek in multiple trips over 2 days, flat-bottom stones for the base layer, rounded ones for the sides fitted together without mortar. In the configuration, Silas's notes described as most efficient for radiating heat outward from the combustion point. She built a sleeping platform from branches cut with her paring knife, a process that took longer than it would have taken with a proper blade, but which she completed because she had learned that the pace of a task was a separate question from whether the task was possible, and she had stopped confusing the two. The platform raised her sleeping body 6 inches off the cold earth. The difference was larger than it had any right to be. She closed the cave entrance with a framework of green saplings lashed together with strips of hickory bark covered with interlaced pine boughs dense enough to cut the wind without sealing the airflow she needed for the fire. She wove baskets from splits of white oak, the technique coming back through her hands from a single afternoon Cora had spent teaching her. From a slab of yellow poplar, she made a cutting board, sanding it smooth with creek grit in the patient back and forth motion her mother had shown her for finishing wood surfaces. From green hickory poles, she built a drying rack and hung it near the outer chamber wall where the fire's warmth would reach it. And on it, she began hanging strips of whatever meat she could snare and bundles of the herbs and plants she foraged from the hillside. Then she turned to the problem of the pots. She had found the reference in Silas's field notebook on a morning when the fire was small and the paring knife was in her hand, and the cold outside was the kind that makes you think with unusual clarity about what you actually need. The passage describes soapstone, a soft metamorphic rock that could be worked with simple tools and would not crack under direct heat the way most rock would. And in the margin in Silas's careful teacher's handwriting was a note he had added from his own observation outcropped near North Fork, approximately 1 mile above current site. Gray-green color, softer than thumbnail. Eliza looked at that note for a long time. She thought about what her father had known and when he had known it, and whether he had known it because he thought he might need it someday, or simply because he had noted it as part of his systematic project of understanding the place he lived. She decided it didn't matter. He had known it. He had written it down. She had read it until she had it memorized. And now it mattered. It took her 3 weeks to make the pots. This was not the estimate she would have given beforehand, which had been a few days. The soapstone, once she found the outcrop and pressed her thumbnail into the surface and watched it leave a faint groove, confirming what Silas had written, proved to be soft in the relative sense that stone is ever soft. Workable with sustained effort in the right improvised tools, but not yielding in any way that allowed impatience. She chipped and scraped with the paring knife a sharpened piece of flint she found in the creek bed and a rounded hickory stick she shaped for the inside curves. Her hands bled from the work. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her dress and continued. She rested when she had to. She worked when she could. After 3 weeks, she had 2 vessels rough by any aesthetic standard, but geometrically functional. Walls thick enough to hold heat, bases flat enough to sit stable on a stone surface, and a broad, flat cooking stone wide enough to serve as a griddle. She looked at what her hands had made and she thought about the word her mother would have used for this specific arrangement of tools and heat and stored food that she had assembled in a limestone chamber above Caldwell Hollow. The morning she decided to cook the first real meal we had been in the cave for 31 days. She had caught a rabbit that morning in a snare constructed exactly as Silas had described in the margins of his field notes, a loop of twisted plant fiber set at rabbit chest height on a run between 2 bramble patches anchored to a bent sapling that would tighten the loop when triggered. The rabbit had been a long time coming. She had set and reset the snare for 9 days before that morning's success. She had dried mushrooms gathered and cured over the previous week, wild onions from a south-facing slope, hickory nuts she had shelled and roughly chopped with the paring knife. She built the fire in the pit slowly the way Silas had taught her to build any fire that needed to last kindling first, then small splits of dry wood, then the larger pieces that would burn down to the sustained coals she needed. She let it burn for 2 hours before she began to cook, letting the stones absorb the heat, letting the outer chamber walls begin to warm. She cleaned the rabbit. She cut it into pieces with the paring knife, working carefully, methodically, the way Cora had taught her to break down an animal. Nothing wasted, every part considered. She put the pieces in the soapstone pot with the mushrooms and the onions and the hickory nuts in water she had filtered that morning through the hollow log system. She set the pot on the cooking stone over the banked coals, and then she waited. The soup cooked slowly through most of the afternoon, the heat from the coals moving through the stone and up through the pot bottom with the same steady patience the cave itself had modeled for her. She did not rush it. She tasted it at intervals, adjusting nothing because she had no salt and almost no seasoning, and the flavor that was developing was already something more than the sum of its parts. The mushrooms contributing a deep woody depth, the wild onions giving sweetness and a faint sharpness, the hickory nuts adding a richness she recognized as the lipid content rendering slowly into the liquid around them. She thought about what Cora would say. She thought about the specific quality of attention her mother brought to a pot of soup in the late stages. That slight lean forward, the way she would lift the spoon and watch how the liquid fell back, reading the viscosity, reading the color, reading the information the soup was offering about where it was in its own becoming. Almost, she heard her mother say, "Give it another hour." She gave it another hour. When she ate it, sitting on her sleeping platform with the bowl made from a section of curved bark she had fashioned for exactly this purpose, with the fire low and the cave warm around her, and the wind outside moving through the bare trees at the pitch she had come to recognize as the sound of the mountain in November, she cried. She had not cried since her mother died, which had been 2 years ago. She had decided somewhere in the weeks after Cora's death that there was simply no point in crying anymore, because there was no one to hear it and no situation that could be improved by it. But the soup made her cry, because it tasted the way Cora's kitchen had smelled in the winter when something good had been cooking all day. because she had made it entirely by herself in a place no one on earth knew existed, using knowledge no one had given her credit for having. And because she was 15 years old, and she was alive, and the soup was good, she sat in the warmth of her own making and ate the soup and did not apologize for the tears. And when the bowl was empty, she set it down and wiped her face and looked at the fire and at the rough soapstone pots and at the drying rack with its bundles of herbs and at the woven baskets lined up along the wall. She thought about what her mother would have called this. What word Cora would have used for the specific arrangement of tools and heat and stored food that Eliza had assembled in this limestone chamber above Caldwell Hollow. Her mother would have called it a kitchen. The girl who had been told she was worth nothing had built one. August Fenn had lived alone on the north slope of Smoky Ridge for 11 years by the time he followed the watercress. He was 73 years old and had the body of a man who had spent most of those years in kitchens, thick through the forearms and shoulders, from decades of lifting and carrying and stirring, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone who had learned that economy of motion is not laziness, but craft. He had come to the Ridge in 1924 after 38 years cooking on the Southern Railway's dining cars, a career that had taken him from Atlanta to Memphis to Cincinnati and back again on schedules that had no relationship to the human body's preferences about sleep and rest. He had cooked for governors and railroad presidents. He had cooked for the men who rode the overnight coaches with cardboard in their shoes. And he had understood from early in his career that feeding people well was not a neutral act. It changed something in the room. It changed the quality of the silence after the plates were cleared and the way people looked at each other across a table and whether the conversation that followed had any generosity in it. He had spent 38 years creating those conditions for other people. And when his body finally told him it was done with standing on moving floors, he had come to the mountain because a man he had cooked with on the Cincinnati run had told him about a small cabin on 40 acres with a creek and a root cellar. He had wanted for the first time in his adult life to cook only for himself and to do it in the same place every day. He had not found solitude to be the problem he had been warned it would be. He found it clarifying. The watercress bed was his in the way that a person thinks of any living thing they have cared for consistently. He had not planted it, but he had tended it for 6 years, keeping debris out of the water above it, never harvesting to the roots, visiting it twice a week from April through November, with the quiet regularity of a man who understands that care is mostly a matter of showing up. When he arrived on a Tuesday morning in January of 1935 and found that approximately a third of the bed had been harvested recently, and with some care the harvester having taken the upper growth and left the root systems intact in the way of someone who understood that the plant needed something to grow from, he did not feel violated. He felt curious. He followed the tracks in the creek bank mud because he had spent enough time on this mountain to read sign the way that people who pay attention to things learn to read sign. The tracks told him they had been made by boots too large for the feet inside them, either a child or someone wearing borrowed footwear, and that the person had been here several times over the preceding weeks, always approaching from the north and always departing the same way. He followed the direction of departure. The trail led him along the creek and then up a game trail that switched back twice before leveling onto a narrow bench where the limestone cliff face rose to his left and the ridge dropped away to his right. A curtain of dead Virginia creeper covered an opening in the rock that was on closer inspection. Not an opening, but an entrance. He stood in that entrance and looked at what was inside. The fire in the pit was low, but alive, and its coals banked with the kind of deliberate care a person uses when they intend to be away for a while and want to return to something they can rebuild quickly. The cooking stone beside it was clean. The 2 soapstone vessels on the stone shelf were clean. The baskets along the wall were organized by what they contained with dried material separated from fresh by a gap of approximately 6 inches, the kind of spatial logic that develops when a person has thought carefully about cross-contamination and moisture transfer. The drying rack held strips of cured meat, the color and texture indicating the right combination of temperature and time. Nothing about it suggested haste or improvisation. The water filtration system, a hollow log section positioned to drain into a clay-lined catch basin, showed evidence of multiple refinements, the clay work rough but functional, marked by the unmistakable trace of someone who had failed and corrected and tried again. Gus had worked in professional kitchens for nearly 4 decades. He had trained under men who had trained under men in a tradition of kitchencraft that went back further than any of them could trace. He had seen good kitchens and kitchens that occupied the wide territory between those extremes. He had developed over decades a set of standards against which he measured any cooking space within 30 seconds of entering it: cleanliness, organization, the logic of the layout relative to the work being done, the evidence of whether the person using it was thinking while they worked or simply executing habit. The cave kitchen met his standards in a way that several professional kitchens he had worked in had not, and it had been built by someone with a paring knife and a piece of flint from a material that was technically speaking a geological formation. He was still standing in the entrance, holding his walking stick in one hand and his battered tin lantern in the other, when Eliza came back through the cave entrance behind him with a bundle of dried hickory branches under her arm and stopped. The space between them held the specific quality of two people who have each been surprised and are each deciding simultaneously how to respond to the surprise. The decision each of them arrived at independently and quickly was not to overreact, which told each of them something about the other before either spoke. Gus looked at the girl. She was thin in the way of someone who had been living at the margin for long enough that the thinness had become structural rather than temporary. Her hands were rough. Her face had the weathered stillness of a person who had spent significant time outdoors in conditions that don't accommodate vanity. She was holding the hickory bundle with the relaxed grip of someone who had carried a lot of things, and she was looking at him with an expression that he read as wary but not frightened. He respected that. He told her either he had gone crazy or there was a child living in this hole. She straightened slightly and said she was not a child. She was 15. He held his ground on that by saying nothing, which was the appropriate response. Then he looked again at the cooking setup, the organized baskets, the cured meat on the rack, the filtration system, and he opened his mouth to say something about what he was observing, some acknowledgement of the craftsmanship in front of him. Eliza spoke first. "Do you know how to smoke meat properly?" she asked. Not a challenge, not rudeness. The flat, direct inquiry of someone who has identified a gap in their current capabilities and is assessing whether the person in front of them can fill it. Gus closed his mouth. He looked at the girl for a moment. Then he looked at the cave. Then he looked back at the girl. 58 years, he said. Yes. Then sit down, she said. The fire needs building up. He came back 3 days later with a small cloth bag of salt, which he set on the cooking stone without comment and without any performance of generosity. Just set it down the way you set down something that belongs somewhere and you've finally gotten around to putting it in its place. Eliza was working a pot of broth over the coals. She had been working variations of this broth for weeks, adjusting ratios, trying different combinations of dried mushroom and wild onion in the small amounts of rendered fat she had been accumulating from the occasional rabbit or squirrel the snares produced. The broth was competent. It was nutritious. It sustained her. But something in it was not right, and she had not been able to identify what. She looked at the bag of salt. She looked at the broth. She took a pinch of the salt between her fingers, a precise pinch, the amount Cora had always used for a first edition, enough to begin the conversation without finishing it, and she stirred it in. She waited 30 seconds. She lifted the spoon and tasted. She was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "That's what was missing." Not, "Thank you." Not an expression of relief or wonder. A diagnosis. The clean, precise statement of someone who has been trying to solve a problem and has just identified the last variable. Gus watched her face as she processed the information. The slight forward lean, the second taste, the small adjustment of the hand holding the spoon as she thought about what to do next. He thought about the governors he had cooked for. He thought about the railroad presidents. He thought about the men and women over 38 years who had praised his food in dining cars from Atlanta to Cincinnati and back again. None of them had ever tasted anything the way this 15-year-old girl was tasting a pot of broth in a limestone cave on a Tennessee mountainside. He came back the following week with flour. The week after that, he brought the cast iron skillet, and he said he had a spare, which was not precisely true. Eliza did not challenge it because she understood the transaction, being offered the particular generosity of a person who will not accept gratitude and so frames their gifts as surplus. She accepted it in the spirit it was given. What developed over the following weeks was something neither of them would have described as a friendship in the conventional sense, because conventional friendship implies equality of circumstance and similarity of history. And they had neither of those things. What they had was a mutual recognition of serious purpose, which in practice expressed itself as the most productive kitchen collaboration that either of them had ever been part of. Gus brought knowledge that could not be found in any book Silas Marsh had owned. It was the knowledge that comes from decades of repetition and failure and the specific refinements that failure teaches. He knew how to smoke meat so that it was preserved rather than merely flavored, the distinction being about internal temperature and time and the particular woods that produce the right combination of antimicrobial compounds in their smoke. He showed her how to bank a fire correctly for a long smoke, how to read the color of smoke to know whether the temperature was right, how to tell by pressing a finger lightly against the surface whether the outer layer had formed the crust that would seal moisture inside while the interior continued to transform. He showed her hobo bread baked in the cast iron pot buried in a bed of coals and covered with more coals until the interior reached the temperature bread required without any external heat regulation. An imprecise method that produced in skilled hands a loaf with a crust that crackled and an interior that was moist and dense in a way that satisfied hunger at a level that lighter breads did not. He taught her to render lard from the fat of the wild pigs that moved through the ridge in late fall, a process requiring sustained low-heat patience and the ability to know by smell when the rendering was complete. He taught her to use the lard not just as a cooking fat, but as a preservative coating the exteriors of cured meats to seal out oxygen. Eliza absorbed all of this with the focused attention of someone who has been thinking about exactly these problems for months and is now receiving solutions better than the ones she had arrived at alone. But she gave back. And what she gave back surprised Gus in a way he had not expected to be surprised at 73. She explained the chemistry not condescendingly and not with the tentative apology that young people sometimes use when they have knowledge an older person lacks, but directly and matter-of-factly, as though the information were simply available, and there was no reason not to share it. She explained why salt drew moisture from meat by describing osmotic pressure in terms that required no scientific vocabulary, substituting physical analogies for abstract processes until the mechanism was as clear as the result. She explained why acid brightened flavors by describing what happened at the level of the taste receptor, which she understood imperfectly, but well enough to give Gus a framework for something he had known empirically for decades, without ever having the underlying mechanism. He listened with the quality of attention he had given across 58 years to the very few people who had taught him something genuinely new. He did not perform attention. He simply gave it completely in the way that people who have spent their lives learning by observation know how to do. Your parents, he said one afternoon after she had explained the chemistry behind the smoke curing in a way that reorganized his understanding of something he had done 10,000 times. They must have been remarkable people. Her voice when she answered carried the specific weight of a past tense that has been carried for a long time. They were, she said. He did not press. He had been around enough grief to know that some things don't require a response, they require only the willingness to sit with them for a moment before moving on to the next thing. They built the bread oven together in the spring of 1935, and it took considerably longer than either of them anticipated. The design came from Silas's field notebook, a description of a stone baking oven, common to the rural traditions of the American South and Appalachian Highlands, dome-shaped, constructed from local limestone, mortared with a mixture of clay and ash that would harden as it cured. Eliza had studied the description closely enough to reproduce it in detail, including the specific dimensions of the chamber and the relationship between the chamber volume and the size of the opening, which governed the heat retention characteristics. The limestone they needed was available in the cliff face above the cave in sections that could be broken loose with a steel wedge Gus brought from his cabin. The clay came from a deposit Eliza had identified the previous fall in the creek bank below a seep. The construction required 14 days of intermittent work because the clay mortar needed time to partially dry between courses, and rushing the drying led to settling and cracking, which they discovered the hard way on the fourth day when a section of the lower wall shifted and they had to dismantle it and begin that section again. Gus had never built a stone oven. Eliza had never built anything larger than the crude windbreak at the cave entrance. The process was one of the sustained, occasionally contentious collaborations that result when two people who both know what they want the outcome to be have to negotiate the means of achieving it. They disagreed about the slope of the oven floor and resolved it by building a test model in clay and observing how liquids ran across it when heated. They disagreed about the curing schedule. Gus's instinct said shorter. The written instructions said longer. They resolved it by Gus defaulting to the written instructions and discovering when the oven held its heat through the first full firing without any cracking that the instructions had been right. He sat with that knowledge for a moment in the way of a man who has spent 58 years trusting his instincts and is now being asked to update the trust. "How old was your father when he wrote that?" he asked. "He was writing in his 30s, Eliza said. "He'd read everything about it. He just never had the chance to build one." Gus was quiet. Then he said, "He built it. He just built it through you." Eliza didn't answer, but she looked at the oven and at the notebook in her hand, and something in her face shifted in a way that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but contained elements of both. When the first loaf came out of the finished oven, golden crusted risen in a way that neither of them had been entirely confident the cave conditions would allow with a crumb so open, it seemed to contradict the density of its ingredients. Gus sat down on the stone bench along the cave wall and laughed until there was water in his eyes. He said he had cooked for governors. He said he had never in his life baked bread that good. Eliza cut the loaf with the paring knife and handed him the larger half. She said the crust would soften within an hour and he should eat it now. He said he had been eating bread for 73 years and he knew how to eat bread. She said she was just noting the fact. He ate the bread. It was what it was, which was extraordinary. And they sat in the warmth of the oven and the warmth of the cave and did not say much else because there was nothing that needed saying that the bread had not already said more clearly. The terrace gardens went in that same spring, and this was a project that required different skills than the oven. Eliza had read enough of Silas's soil science notes to understand the principles of terrace construction. The retaining walls needed to be slightly angled back into the slope to resist the pressure of the soil behind them, and the terraces needed to be layered with the organic material to build fertility into what was on the bare hillside largely mineral soil with little capacity to support cultivation. She brought soil from the creek bottom in baskets many more trips than the stones required, layering it with dried leaf material and decomposed wood from fallen logs between the soil courses. What she planted was a deliberate system rather than a garden in the casual sense. The herbs went on the highest terrace where the drainage was best because Silas's notes had specified that aromatic herbs prefer sharp drainage and tend to concentrate their essential oil production under mild stress. The root vegetables went in the middle terrace where she had built up the deepest soil layer. The greens and alliums went on the lowest terrace where the soil retained the most moisture from the hillside seep above. She planted ramps she had transplanted from the creek bottoms, mountain mint grown from cuttings, and a dozen other plants she had been collecting and propagating in small experimental plots near the cave entrance through the winter. Gus watched the terraces take shape over several weeks of work that he participated in to the extent his knees allowed, which Eliza calculated precisely and without comment, giving him tasks that could be done without bending, adjusting the workflow so that his contribution was real without being damaging. He noticed this management without drawing attention to it and appreciated it in the way that older people appreciate being handled with skill rather than with either dismissal or excessive solicitude. "You're thinking several steps ahead," he told her one afternoon, watching her place seedlings in the lower terrace with a spacing that seemed generous for the current size of the plants. "Most people plant for what they can see. You're planting for what isn't there yet." "That's what my mother always did," Eliza said. She pressed the soil firm around a ramp transplant with the heel of her hand. She said the mistake most cooks make is thinking about tonight's dinner. She was always thinking about next month's pantry. Gus turned this over quietly. He had known cooks who thought that way, but he could count them on one hand, and all of them had been professionals with decades of experience. He was looking at a 16-year-old girl with dirt on her hands and worn-out boots on her feet, and she was one of them. By the summer of 1935, the cave and its surrounding improvements constituted something that could reasonably be called a working homestead. The smokehouse stood against the hillside 30 feet from the cave entrance, built from dry stacked limestone with a vent in the roof that could be adjusted to control airflow. The spring house sat over the seep where cold water emerged from the hillside year-round, maintaining a temperature low enough to keep dairy products safe through the summer. The terraces produced through the summer months in quantities that surprised even Eliza, whose estimates had been conservative, because she was still learning the soil's capacity. In August, she had more food on the drying rack and in the storage baskets than she had accumulated in total across the preceding winter. It was in the late summer of 1935 that she traded for the goats 2 does from a widow named Mrs. Hatch, who kept a small herd 2 ridges over and who had animals producing more milk than she could use. The trade was 2 months of preserved food from Eliza's stores in exchange for the does and a basic education in their management. Gus arranged it. Eliza executed it, arriving at Mrs. Hatch's place with a basket of smoked fish, dried mushrooms, and 2 jars of wild apple preserves, and leaving 2 hours later with the does on leads and a working knowledge of milking that Mrs. Hatch had drilled into her until she judged it competent. The cheese came next, and it was harder than Eliza had expected. She failed twice before she succeeded the first time. The first failure smelled wrong before it was mature enough to eat contamination at the pressing stage, dressed by cleaning the pressing surface with the apple cider vinegar she now had in reliable supply. The second failure was the curd not setting properly, traced eventually to the temperature of the milk, when she added the acid which she had been measuring by touch and getting wrong by a consistent margin. She started measuring by the time it took a drop of water on the milk surface to spread to a specific diameter, which was imprecise by any professional standard but sufficiently reproducible for her purposes. The third attempt produced a wheel of semi-hard cheese with a clean, mild flavor and a texture that held under a knife. She cut a slice and gave it to Gus without explanation. He ate it. He was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" he asked. 16, she said. He nodded slowly in the way of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. "Right," he said. It was Gus who first brought a family up to the cave. He had known the Pruitt family from his occasional descents into Caldwell Hollow for supplies. Willa Pruitt, a widow with 3 children and a fourth on the way, working a small farm on the ridge above the hollow that had been failing by degrees for 4 years. He had seen her at the general store in October, seen the way she looked at prices and put things back on the shelf, seen the specific arithmetic of a woman calculating what her family could go without. He mentioned this to Eliza on a Saturday morning in November while they were working the cave kitchen. He described the situation without editorializing, in the way of a man who presents information and lets the person who needs to act on it decide what to do. Eliza listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bring them Saturday." The Pruitt family arrived that next Saturday morning, Willa and her 3 children carrying themselves with the mixture of pride and desperation that characterizes people who have come to accept help for the first time in their lives. Eliza met them at the cave entrance and led them inside and built up the fire and put water on, and did not make any of the gestures or expressions that would have made the visit feel like charity. She understood that charity, however well-intentioned, produces in its recipients a debt that diminishes them. What she wanted to produce was the opposite of diminishment. She fed them first. This was always the order. Feed people first and let the food do what food does when it is made well and given freely, which is to lower the defenses that hunger and pride construct around a person so that learning can actually get in. The bread from the oven that morning was a sourdough that had been developing for 8 hours with the flavor complexity that comes from slow fermentation. When Willa's youngest child bit into the slice Eliza handed her, the girl looked up with an expression that Gus, watching from his seat on the stone bench, recognized immediately: the pure, uncomplicated look of a child tasting something made with genuine care. He had seen it before across 38 years of dining cars. He had never stopped finding it the most important thing in any room. Then Eliza taught. She showed Willa how to make a sourdough starter from flour and water, and the specific handling that encouraged wild yeast colonization rather than bacterial spoilage. She explained not just the steps, but why each step mattered, because she had learned from Silas that understanding why is the difference between being able to do something and being able to do it reliably under varying conditions. She showed her how to keep the starter alive through winter with minimal flour expenditure. She showed her the drying rack and explained the principles of food preservation that made it work. She sent the Pruitt family home with a starter, a paper of dried wild yeast, and 3 pages of notes written in the same careful hand Silas had used in his field notebooks. The Pruitt family talked. They talked to their neighbors and their cousins and the people they saw at church. And what they said was that the marsh girl up in the cave was doing something remarkable, and that she knew what she was doing, and that the food was extraordinary, and didn't people want to come see for themselves. The talk made its way, as talk in small communities always does, to Harlan Briggs. By the winter of 1936, Eliza was running what she had begun to call kitchen days, structured sessions in which anywhere from 4 to a dozen people would spend a morning or an afternoon learning specific skills. She taught bread first, always because bread was the most fundamental and the most sustaining, and because the act of making bread of working living dough with your own hands and watching it transform and smelling, the specific smell of fermentation and then of baking changed something in the people who did it that watching someone else do it did not. She taught preservation in all its available forms: drying, smoking, salting, pickling, rendering fat, making vinegar. She taught people to identify the wild plants of Smoky Ridge that were edible and nutritious and available across the seasons, making these lessons into walks through the woods, with the children turning what could have been a grim exercise in survival into something that felt like discovery. She taught the way Silas had taught everything, with genuine enthusiasm for the subject and real curiosity about what the students noticed that she might have missed. Gus came to the kitchen when his knees allowed it. On the days he came, he sat on the stone bench with a cup of something hot and told stories from his years on the railroad about kitchens on moving trains and passengers who ate in evening clothes and men who cooked over open fires at rail yards at 2 in the morning. The stories were always precise in their details and always carried underneath their surface entertainment a consistent message about the value of skill and the dignity of the work of feeding people. Eliza watched the faces of the people listening to him and saw what Gus gave them that she at 16 could not yet give: historical perspective. The sense that the work they were learning to do was connected to a longer tradition of human beings feeding each other through difficult circumstances, that they were not inventing something out of desperation. They were joining something that had always existed. On the cave walls that winter, 20 people could fit on a kitchen day if everyone moved carefully, which they had learned to do. Bowls were passed hand to hand from the pot to the people sitting on the stone benches and on the rough log sections that served as stools. The cave on those days smelled of bread and wood smoke and wet wool and the particular human warmth of bodies in an enclosed space who are for the moment neither cold nor hungry. And Eliza moved through this warmth, distributing food and instruction with a quality of presence that Gus watching recognized without being able to immediately name. It took him several weeks to find the right word for it. The word was authority, not the authority of position or force, but the authority that belongs to a person who was in the place they were made for doing the thing they were made to do. He had seen it rarely across 73 years. He was glad he had lived long enough to see it again. Harlan Briggs heard about the cave kitchen in October of 1936, heard about it from Vera Dowd, who had heard about it from 3 different people, which meant it had already been the subject of enough conversation that Vera considered it established fact rather than gossip. She told him the way she told him most things, that she considered good news for the community with a kind of civic satisfaction, expecting that he would share in it. The Marsh girl, she said, was up on the ridge teaching people to feed themselves. Families from 5 communities had been going up there. The food was extraordinary, people said. The girl knew what she was doing. Briggs listened with the stillness of a man who is processing something that does not fit the category he has prepared for it. He had put a story into the world about Eliza Marsh. That story said she was a thief. It said she was the kind of person whose word couldn't be trusted, whose judgment was poor, who had been put out of a decent house for good reason. He had put that story into circulation the morning he threw her out, and he had counted on it to do the work that stories do in small communities, to precede her, to define her, to make her unwelcome in the places she might otherwise have found welcome. The story had worked for a while. He knew she had gone north up the mountain. He had assumed, and the assumption had felt reasonable at the time, that north in November with no coat and no supplies was a direction that solved the problem on its own terms. But the story, it appeared, had stopped working. And what had replaced it was a different story, one in which the girl he had called worthless had climbed a mountain and built something that people were traveling considerable distances to reach, and from which they were returning with skills and food, and a quality of nourishment that made them look, by all accounts, like people who had been given something that could not be taken back. Briggs understood with the clarity that fear sometimes produces what was happening. The people of Caldwell Hollow were going up the mountain to the girl he had thrown out and publicly called a thief, and they were being fed by her. When the winter ended, they would remember who had been where when it mattered. They would remember whose table had been full and whose had been empty. They would remember whose generosity had been real and whose had been performed. He told Vera the food was probably not safe. He said a girl living alone on a mountain with no proper training had no business feeding people, and that folks should be careful about eating from a source they couldn't verify. He said other things as well, the kind of things a man says when he is frightened and trying to sound authoritative, things that have the quality of words spoken to fill silence rather than to inform. Some people in Caldwell Hollow heard these statements and gave them the weight they deserved. Several families stopped making the trip up the mountain, not because they believed Briggs entirely, but because the social cost of openly defying him, given what they owed him, and the history they had with him, was more than they were prepared to pay. Eliza heard about this through Gus, who heard about it in the Hollow. She understood the dynamics without bitterness, because Silas had taught her that the social mechanisms of small communities are predictable, and that predicting them correctly is more useful than resenting them. She did not adjust what she was doing. She did not try to counter Briggs's message directly. She simply continued cooking. She continued teaching. She continued letting the results speak in the only language that actually persuades people who have been told two contradictory things, the language of evidence. The winter of 1937 arrived in Caldwell Hollow with the particular weight of a winter that follows years of accumulated hardship. Briggs's cattle herd had been hit by a respiratory illness in November and December that moved through the animals with appalling efficiency, killing 40 head before the outbreak ran its course. Three of his tenant families, watching the herd diminish and their own futures recalculate accordingly, loaded what they owned onto trucks and left before the worst of the cold arrived. The general store at the bottom of the hollow closed in January. The community that had organized itself around Harlan Briggs's economic gravity for 30 years was coming apart in pieces, each piece making the remaining pieces less stable. In February, Leland Pruitt got sick. He was 5 years old, the youngest child of Willa Pruitt, who had been one of Eliza's first kitchen day students, who had been making sourdough bread every week since that first Saturday, the previous fall, who had been teaching her neighbors what Eliza had taught her, who had become, in the modest geography of her community, a small replication of what the cave kitchen was doing at larger scale. The fever came on in the second week of February and climbed through the first day and into the second. By the third morning, it had reached the territory where a fever stops being a symptom and starts being a danger in itself, the territory where a mother's hands and prayers are not sufficient and something else is required. Willa had no money for the doctor. The doctor in town had reduced his hours due to his own supply problems. She had no medicine, and she had the specific helplessness of a parent watching a child's body work against itself with nothing in her hands capable of changing the direction of it. She climbed the mountain at 11 o'clock at night. She climbed it the way she had climbed it a dozen times on Saturday mornings, following the path she had memorized over months of kitchen days, knowing the switchbacks and the narrow bench and the limestone cliff face and the curtain of Virginia creeper at the entrance. She climbed it in February darkness with her son wrapped in every blanket she owned and the cold working through both of them. Eliza heard her coming before she saw her. She had learned the sounds of the mountain, which sounds belonged to it and which sounds were people. She was at the cave entrance when Willa came into the clearing with the child in her arms and the expression of a person who has run out of other options. Eliza took the child. She brought him to the fire and assessed him the way Silas had taught her to assess anything systematically, beginning with what she could observe directly and moving outward toward inference. The fever was high. The child was responsive, not yet delirious. His breathing was clear, which ruled out the complication she would have been most concerned about. She put water on to heat. When it reached the right temperature, she made a preparation from the dried herbs she kept in the inner chamber, wild garlic for its antimicrobial properties, which she had read about in Silas's notes and confirmed through her own 2 years of observation. Mountain mint for fever reduction, a small amount of dried bone set that Silas's notes mentioned, specifically for fever management in the Appalachian tradition, the plant name written in his careful hand with 3 exclamation marks beside it, which was his way of marking something he considered particularly reliable. She fed it to the child in small sips over the course of 2 hours, while the fire burned high and the cave temperature rose. And she told Willa what each herb was and what it did and why. This was not a casual choice. Eliza understood that a person in crisis needs something to hold on to, something that is not hope in the abstract but comprehension in the specific. Understanding why is a thing to hold. It does not stop the fear, but it gives the fear something to stand next to something solid so that the fear does not fill the entire room. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the fever had broken. Not dramatically, not with the sudden resolution that stories sometimes describe. Gradually, the way a real fever breaks, the child sweating through his blankets, and then quieting and then sleeping with the profound unconsciousness of a body that has stopped fighting and started recovering. Willa sat across the fire from Eliza with her hands around a clay cup of warm water and said nothing for a long time. She looked at the cave, at the organized baskets and the drying rack in the oven and the stone shelves with their careful inventory of preserved food. She looked at the girl across the fire, who was 16 years old and whose hands were rough from 3 years of building something out of nothing, and whose face in the firelight had the particular stillness of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Willa did not say what she was thinking, but what she was thinking was visible in the way she looked, the recalibration happening behind her eyes, the old calculations dissolving and new ones forming. She went back down the mountain in the gray early morning, carrying her sleeping son, following the path she had climbed in darkness 12 hours before. And she told people what she told people, which was the specific truth that she had gone up the mountain at night with a sick child and come down the following morning with a child who was going to be fine. That the girl in the cave had known exactly what to do, that she had explained every step, that the herbs she had used were growing on the ridge where anyone could find them if they knew what to look for. She did not editorialize. She did not argue against anything Harlan Briggs had said. She simply told what had happened, and the truth of what had happened carried more weight than anything Briggs had put into circulation, because the truth had a child's sleeping face behind it and a mother's steady voice describing it. And those two things together were more persuasive than any other argument that had been made on either side. The families from Caldwell Hollow began coming up the mountain in the days that followed, alone at first, and then in groups. They arrived at the cave entrance with the combination of expressions that people wear when they have been wrong about something for a long time and are now arriving at the correction, something between sheepishness and relief, neither of which they were entirely prepared to display, but both of which were visible anyway. They found the cave kitchen in its winter operation, the oven fired, the long stone shelf holding the day's bread, the bowls filled from the pot near the fire, the terraces below the entrance with their cold frames of salvaged glass keeping greens alive under a crust of snow. They found the smokehouse and the spring house and the organized storage and the evidence in every direction they looked of 3 years of sustained and intelligent work. And they found Eliza Marsh, 17 years old, steady and without recrimination, moving through her kitchen with the particular ease of a person who is exactly where she belongs. She handed them bowls. She told them to sit down. She said there was enough. And there was. August Fenn died on a morning in late April of 1938 in his sleep in the cabin he had lived in for 14 years. He had complained of nothing. He had been at the cave kitchen the previous Saturday, sitting on the stone bench with his cup of coffee, watching Eliza demonstrate the correct technique for scoring sourdough before loading it into the oven, the shallow, decisive cuts that allow the bread to open along controlled lines rather than bursting unpredictably from the pressure of the oven's heat. He had offered one comment, which was that she was holding the blade at the wrong angle, and she had adjusted without argument because he was right, and the loaves that came out that morning had opened perfectly along their scores, the crust splitting back in the way that good bread splits with a kind of inevitability, as though it had always intended to open exactly there. He had been by every observable measure entirely himself. The neighbor who found him said he looked peaceful, which is what people say, and which in Gus's case Eliza believed was true, because Gus had been a man who had made his peace with most things long before the end came, and who had arranged his life in his 11 years on the ridge into a shape that did not leave much unresolved. She walked the 2 miles to his cabin when she heard, and she sat beside him for a while in the particular quiet that belongs to a room where someone has recently stopped being alive, the quality of silence that is different from ordinary silence in a way that is difficult to name but impossible to mistake. She sat with him the way the people he had cooked for over 38 years had never had occasion to sit with him, without any transaction pending, without any role to perform, just the plain acknowledgement of what he had been and what that meant. The cast iron skillet was on the cabin's cook stove where she had last seen it the previous fall when she had visited him before the cold made the walk less practical. Looking at it was harder than she had expected. She had not known until the moment of his absence how completely she had come to rely on his presence, not for the practical things he brought, not for the specific knowledge he had given her, but for the way he had seen her clearly from the first moment and had simply treated what he saw as worthy of his full respect. That kind of being seen is not common. She had had it from her parents, she had had it from Gus, and she understood sitting in that cabin that it was the foundation under everything she had built that, without being seen accurately, at the beginning, she might not have had the confidence to do what she had done. He left her everything he had, the cast iron cookware complete and seasoned, representing decades of accumulated care. The notebooks in which he had recorded 40 years of recipes and observations, and the kind of professional knowledge that does not survive its practitioner unless someone thinks to write it down. And a letter written in the deliberate cursive of a man who had not had many occasions for letter writing, but had taken this occasion seriously. She read the letter standing in his kitchen with the morning light coming through the single window above the sink. He wrote that she was the finest cook he had ever known and that he had known many. He wrote that what made her exceptional was not her technical mastery, which was real and substantial, but her understanding of what food was actually for, which was to bring people toward each other and to repair the things that life breaks and that she should not ever stop. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in the canvas bag she had carried down from Harlan Briggs's yard 3.5 years before, the same bag that held the photograph of Cora and the books and the paring knife with the electrical tape handle, because the letter belonged with those things, the things that constituted the actual material of who she was. She walked back to the cave as the afternoon light moved down the ridge. And in the morning she fired the oven earlier than usual and baked through the morning without particular purpose beyond the fact that the baking needed to be done, and the doing of it was the way she had always moved through the unbearable parts of her life, by placing her hands on something real, by producing something that could be given to another person. She was 19 years old. She had a cave kitchen and a sourdough starter and a cast iron skillet and 40 years of a dead man's knowledge written in notebooks on a shelf. She had 3 pages of her father's field notes, a photograph of her mother laughing at something outside the frame, and a paring knife with a handle wrapped in electrical tape. She had everything she needed. She got to work. The 2 years between Gus's death and the morning Calhoun Whitfield arrived with a load of white oak lumber were the years in which Eliza Marsh became fully and without remainder the person she had been becoming since she was 15 years old, standing in a frozen yard with a canvas bag in her hand. She expanded the kitchen days to 3 communities beyond Caldwell Hollow, training 2 women from neighboring ridge settlements to run their own sessions, giving them not just the techniques, but the underlying principles. Because she understood that techniques without principles are fragile things dependent on memory and repetition, while principles travel and adapt and survive conditions that specific instructions cannot anticipate. She added 6 beehives to the south-facing slope above the terraces, learning beekeeping from a manual Gus had left with his notebooks, approaching the bees with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, observing before intervening, understanding the system before trying to modify it. By the 2nd year, she had honey in sufficient quantity to trade, and the trading extended her reach further into the communities that surrounded Smoky Ridge. She added a 2nd goat and expanded the cheese operation, refining her technique with each batch until the wheels coming out of the cave's inner chamber were consistent enough that she could predict their flavor and texture before they were mature enough to cut. She extended the growing season on the terraces by 3 weeks on each end, improving the cold frames and adjusting what she planted, and when based on 2 years of careful observation of how each microclimate on the hillside behaved in the shoulder seasons. And on the evenings when the cave was empty and the fire was low, and the mountain held its deep autumn quiet, she sat on the sleeping platform she had built 6 years ago and conducted in the privacy of her own thoughts an honest accounting of her life. The accounting was not simple. There were things missing from it, that she was aware of things that she had not allowed herself to think about directly during the years of building and teaching and feeding, because there had always been more immediate work to do. But in the quiet of those evenings, with the inventory of her life arranged around her in the form of organized baskets and cured meats and a sourdough starter that had been alive for 6 years, she let herself think about them. She was 20 years old. She had built something real. She had done it alone, and then with Gus, and then with the community that had gathered around what she and Gus had built. But the alone part was also still present, not as suffering, but as a fact. The kind of fact that a person who is honest with herself cannot avoid indefinitely. She was still thinking about this with the incomplete clarity of someone who has identified a question without yet finding the answer when Calhoun Whitfield came around the last bend in the trail on a Tuesday morning in April of 1940. He had a flatbed wagon loaded with white oak lumber and a delivery note made out to the estate of August Fenn, deceased, which had ordered the wood the previous autumn, before anyone knew Gus would not be alive to receive it. Calhoun was 26 years old, lean through the shoulders in the way of someone who had been working with his hands since he was old enough to be useful, with the particular steadiness of movement that belongs to carpenters, who have learned that the difference between good work and poor work is almost always a question of patience rather than skill. He had grown up in Harlan County, 40 miles to the northeast, in a household that had been poor in the specific way of households where the poverty is structural and the people in it are not responsible for the structure, but inhabit it completely. He had put himself through 2 years of agricultural college in Knoxville on a combination of work-study arrangements and stubbornness, and when the money finally ran out, he had taken the incomplete education and applied it to the available work, which was carpentry, because he had the hands for it and the precision for it, and because wood, unlike most of the other things in his life up to that point, behaved according to rules that rewarded careful attention. He had known Gus Fenn the way that a hungry 14-year-old knows a man who feeds him without making him feel the weight of the transaction. He had been passing through on a stretch of road between jobs in the late summer of 1928, carrying what he owned in a canvas pack, and Gus had been sitting on the porch of his cabin when Calhoun came around the bend in the trail and had looked at the boy with the accurate eye of a man who could identify hunger in a face before it announced itself. He had said nothing beyond telling Calhoun to come in off the road and sit down, and he had put food on the table without ceremony or commentary. Calhoun had thought about Gus Mercer with gratitude across the 12 years since, in the intermittent way that formative people get thought about when life is moving too fast for sustained reflection. When he arrived at the cave that April morning, following the directions Gus's neighbor had given him for the delivery, he came around the last bend in the trail and stopped. He had been told there was a cave. He had formed an image from that word that was approximately accurate in its geological particulars and entirely wrong in every other respect. What he saw was not a cave with a girl living in it. What he saw was an operating farm, organized around a cave as its central structure, terrace gardens descending the hillside below the entrance. In 4 levels, the retaining walls built with the care that an experienced stonemason would recognize as competent. The terraces themselves showing the specific richness of soil that has been built up deliberately over several years. The smokehouse standing to the left of the entrance, dry stacked stone with a fitted cap. The spring house below the terraces at the seep line, small and tight and doing its job. The cold frames along the south-facing wall of the lower terrace, salvaged glass and timber frames fitted and sealed with clay, and through the glass, the green of growing things in April in the Tennessee mountains, approximately 3 weeks earlier than the open ground would allow. He stood and looked at this for a long moment with the appraising eye of someone trying to understand how something was built, rather than simply registering that it was there. Eliza came out of the cave entrance when she heard the wagon. She stood at the top of the path and looked at him with the directness she had developed across 6 years of living by her own assessment of people, the assessment of someone who has learned that reading a person accurately at the beginning saves considerable difficulty later. He told her he had a delivery for the Fenn estate and showed her the order. She came down the path and looked at the lumber. She said she had been wondering when it would come and that Gus had ordered it for the storage expansion he had been planning before he died. Then she looked at Calhoun with the same directness she had brought to everything since she was 15 years old, standing in front of a strange old man in the entrance to her cave. "Are you a carpenter?" she asked. He said he was. She looked at the wagon, then at the cave entrance, then at the space between the two, with the calculating expression of someone measuring the distance between what exists and what she needs. "Do you have other work waiting?" she asked. He said he had a key in the next county, starting in 3 weeks. "Do you want work for those 3 weeks?" He did not ask what the work paid. She noted this. She also noted that he had been looking at the terraces and the smokehouse and the cold frames with the appraising eye of someone trying to understand how something was built, rather than simply registering that it was there. He was looking at her work the way Gus had looked at it the first morning, not with the expression of someone who is surprised that a girl has done this, but with the expression of someone assessing the quality of the doing itself. She told him she needed the storage structure extended on the north side of the cave entrance, a proper door hung on the existing cold storage room, and a set of benches for the teaching kitchen sized correctly for adults to work standing at, rather than the sections of log that were currently serving that purpose. He took the small carpenter's notebook from his shirt pocket and asked 2 questions, both of them practical. The frost line for the foundation stones of the new structure, whether she had a preference for the bench height or whether he should assess it against the people who would be using them. She told him the frost line was 18 inches at this location, which she knew because she had dug to it twice. She told him the bench height should be assessed against users ranging from 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 9, the range of the women who came to the kitchen days most regularly. He wrote this down, then he began unloading the lumber. He did not leave at the end of 3 weeks. He finished the storage extension and the door and the benches, and then looked at the teaching kitchen and identified 4 additional improvements that would make it function significantly better. He named these to Eliza in the direct way she had come to expect from him, by then presenting them as observations rather than suggestions, letting her decide what to do with the information. She told him to build them. He built them. When those were done, there were other things, because there are always other things in a working operation that has been built primarily by one person without the specific skills of a builder. And Calhoun had the skills and the eye to see what was needed in the hands to produce it. On an evening in June, sitting at the table after the week's kitchen day had ended and the students had gone home, he asked her why she didn't charge for what she taught. It was not a challenge. It was the question of someone genuinely trying to understand the economic model of what he was observing. She told him that the people who came to the kitchen days did not have money, which was why they needed to learn to feed themselves without it, and that charging them for the knowledge would be charging them for the solution to a problem she was not responsible for creating. He thought about this and said the logic was sound, but that it required her to absorb the cost herself, and that there was a limit to how long a person could sustain an operation that produced for others without producing for herself. She said the cave produced enough for her needs and that her needs were not large. He said that was a position which required being right about what you needed, and that most people were wrong about it in one direction, and she seemed to be wrong about it in the other. She considered this and said he might be right and that she would think about it. What she did not say, because she had not yet found the language for it, was that charging for what she knew felt like a betrayal of the chain of transactions that had made the knowledge possible. Her parents had not charged her. Gus had not charged her. The mountain had not charged her. The knowledge had come through a chain of generosity extending back further than she could trace, and charging for the end product of that chain felt like breaking something in the structure of the thing itself. Some load-bearing element that would not survive the substitution of commerce for a gift. She didn't find the words for this until much later, but she held the position and he respected it. And this was one of the early indicators of the specific quality of their compatibility, that they could disagree about something without either of them requiring the other to be wrong. Calhoun stayed through the summer and into the fall. By the time the first frost came, it had become apparent to both of them that the question of his staying had stopped being a question. He went back to Harlan County in November to settle the practical matters of his life there, which took 3 weeks and involved the transfer of a small amount of equipment and the conclusion of 2 outstanding jobs he had been holding open. He came back to the ridge in December with his tools and his books and the particular self-contained quality of a person who has decided something and acted on it without requiring external validation of the decision. They married in the spring of 1941 on a Saturday when the kitchen day students were already there, because Eliza had decided that a wedding at the cave made more sense than a wedding anywhere else, and that the people who had built their lives around the cave were the appropriate witnesses to a marriage being built around it as well. 60 people crowded into the cave and the space outside the entrance and the upper terrace. Both ovens were loaded. Gus's cast iron cookware was in use on every available surface. The bread that came out of the stone oven that afternoon was, by the consensus of everyone present, the best bread any of them had ever eaten, though whether this was a function of the bread itself or the occasion was a question that could not be answered and did not need to be. Eliza was 22 years old. She had been building since she was 15. She had been teaching since she was 16. She had been feeding people since before she could remember. And now she had a partner who understood the work, not because she had explained it to him, but because he had watched it and recognized it for what it was: the most serious work either of them had ever seen up close. Calhoun built what he built over the following years with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The dining hall went up first, a stone structure attached to the cave entrance, with a soaring central fireplace, built from the same limestone as the cave walls, large enough to take a full cord of wood in a single loading, and to heat a room that seated 60 people at the long tables Calhoun built from salvaged timber. The teaching kitchen came next, a dedicated space with 12 working stations, each with its own small hearth and its own preparation surface, so that students could work through processes simultaneously rather than watching a single demonstration, which Eliza had identified as the central limitation of the cave-based sessions. She had opinions about learning efficiency that were as well developed as her opinions about bread. Calhoun built to those opinions with the same precision he brought to structural calculations. He added storage buildings as the operation expanded. A series of small guest cabins along the ridgeline for the people who began arriving from counties and then from other states as the reputation of the cave kitchen grew in the specific exponential way that genuine excellence grows before mass communication through the testimony of people who have experienced it and cannot stop talking about it. He built a proper road from the valley floor to the cave, graded and drained, because the path Eliza had climbed on her first night in November of 1934 was no longer adequate to the traffic coming up it. The road took 3 months and was the hardest single project Calhoun undertook. When it was finished, Eliza stood at the bottom and looked up at it. She said it was a good road. He knew what that meant because she was not a person who said things she did not mean. They had 3 children across the 1940s, 2 sons and a daughter named Ruth. The children grew up in the cave kitchen, the way children grow up in a place that is the center of their parents' life completely, and without the distance that children develop when they are managed away from the thing that drives the people they love. Ruth Whitfield could shape a loaf before she could write her name. She knew the difference between a properly proofed dough and an underproofed one by touch before she was 6. She grew up understanding that the work her mother did was not a job in the sense of something that occupies time in exchange for money, but a practice in the older sense of that word, something that required daily commitment and produced daily meaning and could not be separated from the person doing it without diminishing both. Harlan Briggs came up the mountain in the fall of 1946, and he came alone. He was 63 years old, and the years since 1937 had diminished him in the specific way that diminishes men whose identity is inseparable from what they own, so that the loss of the property is also simultaneously the loss of the self. The cattle operation was gone. The 3,000 acres had been sold in pieces over 9 years to pay debts that accumulated faster than the income from a depleted herd could service. Each sale had been smaller than the one before. The process had ended when there was nothing left to sell. His wife had left in 1942 for her sister's house in Knoxville, not in anger, but in the tired way of someone who has been waiting for a change that did not come. He was living in a rented room above the old general store that had been under new ownership for 4 years. He had been living there long enough that the room had stopped feeling temporary. He was hungry in the plain physical sense of the word, which had not been true of him at any point in his previous 62 years. And the hunger had stripped away the layers of self-presentation that prosperity had allowed him to maintain and left him with something closer to the bare fact of himself, which was a man who had been wrong about many things for a long time and who was arriving at this knowledge too late to do much about most of it. He stood at the edge of the clearing above the road's end, holding his hat in both hands in the way of a man who does not know what to do with his hands. He looked at the cave entrance and the dining hall and the gardens and the smoke coming from the chimney of the bread oven. He looked at the people moving through the space, women at the teaching kitchen stations visible through the open door, children carrying baskets down from the upper terrace, men building something along the north wall. He had known this place existed for 9 years since Vera Dowd had first told him about it. In those 9 years, he had thought about it many times and arrived each time at the same stopping point, the distance between what he had done and the act of walking toward what it had produced. Today, he had walked past that stopping point. He was not entirely sure how. He thought it might simply be that he had run out of reasons not to. Eliza saw him from the teaching kitchen doorway. She recognized him immediately, not because he looked the same, because he did not, but because some people are recognizable regardless of what time does to them. The thing that makes them recognizable is not physical. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the man who had stood in his doorway 11 years ago and told her she was worth nothing, and who was now standing at the edge of her clearing holding his hat in both hands. She crossed the clearing toward him at her ordinary pace, without urgency, without hesitation, without the quality of confrontation that the moment might have been expected to carry, because she had not spent 11 years building something in order to spend the rest of her life being defined by the moment that had started it. He looked at the ground. His voice, when he found it, had the roughness of a voice that has not been used much recently. He said he had been wrong about her, wrong about everything. The words carried the weight of a man who had rehearsed them enough times to know they were inadequate and was saying them anyway because inadequacy is not a sufficient reason for silence. Eliza looked at him for a moment with the full attention she gave to everything she looked at, taking in the hat held in both hands, the diminished shoulders, the face that had been weathered past the point where pride could organize it. Then she said, "Come in, the soup is hot." She led him to the long table and brought him a bowl of white bean soup with a piece of cornbread on the side, and she set it down in front of him without ceremony, without the weight of the occasion pressing on the gesture, because she had understood for years that the power of feeding someone is precisely in its ordinariness, in the fact that it says you are a person who needs to eat, and I am a person who has food, and the distance between those two facts is the distance I am choosing to close. The dozen people in the dining hall that afternoon witnessed this without comment. Harlan Briggs ate with his eyes on the bowl. He became a regular presence at the cave kitchen after that, not as a student and not as a helper in any formal sense, but in the way that people who need a place to be find a place to be. He sat at the long table on Saturday mornings and drank coffee and was quiet. Occasionally he spoke with the men who came up from the valley. And what he said to them when the question of Eliza's kitchen arose was consistent and without elaboration. He told them she was the finest cook he had ever encountered and that he had been a fool. That was all he said. It was enough. The decades that followed were not the dramatic years. They were the years of sustained and daily work, which is a different kind of story and a harder one to tell because it does not produce the events that stories usually require. It produces instead the accumulated weight of consistent presence, the compounding interest of daily commitment, the specific form of abundance that can only be built the way a forest is built, 1 year at a time each year, depending on the year before. The state of Tennessee sent a representative in the spring of 1950 to present Eliza with a citation for community service. She received it with the equanimity she brought to everything, read the certificate at the long table one Saturday morning, folded it carefully and put it in the canvas bag that still held the photograph of Cora and Gus's letter and Silas's paring knife, because she was a person who kept what mattered in the same place. The 1950s brought changes to Caldwell Hollow that were not so different from the changes happening everywhere in rural America, the changes that come when a country that has survived depression and war turns its attention to the construction of a peacetime prosperity. It tends to be large and lasting. Some families in the Hollow got cars, and then televisions, and then refrigerators. The urgency of starvation was replaced by the lesser, but still present urgency of not quite having enough and not quite knowing how to make it last. The kitchen days continued through this decade with the same attendance they had always had, because the knowledge Eliza taught was useful in poverty and useful in sufficiency and would be useful in any condition between the two. A professor from the University of Tennessee arrived in the summer of 1963 with a letter of introduction and a research project he described as a study of indigenous food preservation and agricultural techniques in the Appalachian Highlands. He spent 3 days asking Eliza questions. He asked about the terrace construction, the soil management, the four-season production system, the cave's temperature, regulation, the food preservation methods. She answered all of them in the direct and precise language she had been using to teach for 30 years, explaining the principles behind each practice in terms that were accessible rather than technical, but which were technically accurate. Because she had her father's conviction that explaining things simply is not the same as explaining them incorrectly. The professor wrote a paper that described the cave kitchen system as a sophisticated and independently developed approach to sustainable mountain agriculture that anticipated by decades certain principles then being explored in academic agricultural science. The paper was cited in other papers for the next 20 years. Several of those papers did not mention Eliza Marsh by name. The professor wrote to tell her about this with some frustration. Eliza read his letter at the long table and set it aside without particular frustration of her own because she had never been in the business of being cited. The 1970s brought to Smoky Ridge a steady stream of young people who had concluded that the way their parents and grandparents had organized American life was insufficient and who were looking for alternatives with the genuine urgency of people who believe the world is ending and the partial urgency of people who are also in their 20s. They came because someone had written about the cave kitchen in a Back to the Land magazine published out of Vermont, describing Eliza Marsh as a woman who had been doing for 40 years what the movement was trying to learn to do, which was live from the land with genuine skill rather than romantic intention. Eliza was 55 years old in 1974 and had been teaching at the cave for nearly 4 decades. She taught the young people who arrived in the 1970s the same way she taught everyone, without condescension and without nostalgia. She had no interest in the way things used to be as an organizing principle. She was interested in what worked, and what worked was what she taught. She taught a 23-year-old from Ohio how to build a stone oven using the same limestone and clay ash mortar she and Gus had figured out together in the spring of 1935, not as a piece of historical reproduction, but as a practical building method that would produce a functional oven outlasting any metal appliance he could buy. She taught a young woman from California how to manage a sourdough starter with the specific attention to temperature and timing she had been refining for 40 years. And she told her that the starter was not a symbol of anything. It was a living culture that required consistent care. The care was the point. Calhoun Whitfield died on a Tuesday morning in November of 1971. He was 57 years old and had been in good health. The previous evening, he had been building a new cold frame for the lower terrace in the failing October light, the kind of work he had been doing for 30 years, which had shown no indication of being the last thing. Eliza found him in the workshop he had built along the north wall of the cave entrance, with his tools put away in their places and the cold frame laid out on the work table, ready for the glazing that would happen the following morning. She buried him on the ridge above the cave in the place she had identified years earlier as the right place of view down the valley to Caldwell Hollow and a stand of old-growth hickory to the north that produced enough nuts in a good year to supply the kitchen through the winter. Ruth and her 2 brothers came for the burial. The people from the ridge communities came. The people from Caldwell Hollow came. Former students who lived within driving distance came. The grave was covered with flowers that people brought and with bread that someone baked and left at the marker because they knew that was the right thing to bring to this particular place. She continued, "This is not a simple statement. It describes an act of will that is invisible from the outside because it does not produce dramatic events, only continued presence and continued work, which are not dramatic but are not simple either." She continued teaching through the 1970s with the help of Ruth, who had returned to the ridge after her own children were grown, and with the help of the network of former students who treated the cave kitchen as a responsibility they had inherited along with the knowledge it had given them. She continued baking bread every morning, firing the original oven she and Gus had built in the spring of 1935, which had now been in continuous operation for over 35 years and showed no inclination to stop working. Her arthritis became serious in her late 70s, advancing through the joints of her hands in the particular way of arthritis in people who have used their hands hard their whole lives with a thoroughness that suggested it knew exactly where the most important losses would be. She could no longer knead dough when she was 79. She knew it on the morning she tried and felt the absence of the strength required and understood it was not coming back. She sat in the chair Calhoun had built for her years ago, positioned beside the oven at exactly the right height, at exactly the right angle, because he had watched her work for 30 years and had built the chair to fit the specific way she stood when she was closest to what she was doing. She sat in that chair and she talked Ruth through every step of the morning bread with the precision of a person who has done something 10,000 times and knows it well enough to transmit it accurately through language, even when the hands are no longer available. Ruth's hands moved through the dough. Eliza's voice moved through the morning. And what was transmitted was not diminished by the method of its transmission, because the knowledge was the same and the care behind it was the same. The bread that came out of the oven was, as far as anyone who tasted it could tell, the same bread that had been coming out of that oven for decades, which meant it was extraordinary. She died on a morning in March of 2001 in the cabin that Calhoun had built for them beside the cave in her sleep in the early gray light before the birds had started, which was the time of day she had always been awake for because it was when the oven needed to be started and the starter needed to be fed. She was 82 years old. Ruth found her at 6 o'clock in the morning when she came to begin the day's bread. She sat with her mother for a while before she did anything else in the way that Eliza had taught her, to sit with the important things before moving on to the necessary ones. More than 300 people came to the funeral from the hollows and valleys and ridge communities of 3 counties, traveling in some cases considerable distances on the kind of mountain roads that eastern Tennessee produces, which are not always easy. They came because she had fed them, or because she had taught them, or because their parents had been fed and taught, and they understood, having grown up with the results of that feeding and teaching, that they were there because of her, in a way that was more than metaphorical. The burial was on the ridge above the cave near Calhoun in the Hickory Stand. The service was conducted by a minister who had been one of Eliza's Kitchen Day students in 1952, and who understood that the appropriate thing to say was simple and specific, which was that she had known what food was for and had never stopped acting on that knowledge, and that the world she was leaving was measurably better fed than the world she had entered. Ruth Whitfield ran the cave kitchen for 15 more years after her mother's death, until her own health made the daily demands of the operation impractical. She handed it to the organization that maintains it now, a nonprofit whose board includes the grandchildren of people who came to the cave hungry in the winter of 1937 and left with bread and knowledge and the understanding that knowing how to feed yourself and the people around you is not a skill among other skills, but something closer to the foundation under all the other skills. The thing that makes the others possible. The bread oven stands in its original location. The limestone blocks and the clay ash mortar, now darkened with decades of heat, cured to a color that is not quite any other color. Something between iron and earth, are exactly where Eliza and Gus placed them in the spring of 1935. They fire it every Saturday morning at 5 o'clock, which is when Eliza always fired it, and the firing follows the same sequence she established in that first year. The same progression from kindling to small wood to the large splits that bring the dome to temperature. The same waiting period before the first loaves go in. The same way of testing the heat by the behavior of a handful of flour thrown against the dome's interior, which should darken in 3 seconds if the oven is ready. The sourdough starter is still alive. It has been alive continuously since a December evening in 1934, when a 15-year-old girl sat on a sleeping platform in a limestone cave and decided, without quite making a decision, the way her hands had fed her mother's starter on the day Cora died, that keeping something alive was what she did, and that this particular thing was worth keeping. It has been fed every morning for nearly 70 years, through a marriage and its loss, through 3 children and 5 grandchildren, through the teaching of more than 400 people and the feeding of an uncounted number of others, through the deaths of everyone who had been alive when it was started, through all the changes that happened to a place and a community across 7 decades of American life, most of which are large and some of which are devastating, and all of which the starter has outlasted by the simple method of being fed each morning. The bread it makes is what people say it is. There is something in it that resists the kind of description that satisfies something that belongs to the category of tastes that carry more than taste, that arrive with information about their origins, that the tongue cannot process but that the rest of the body receives anyway. People who eat it for the first time sometimes become quiet in a way that is not about the eating. They are tasting something made by stubbornness and by grief and by the specific intelligence of a girl who understood that the best response to being told you were worthless was to spend your life producing something of irreducible value and give it away to everyone who was hungry enough to need it. The cave is still there. The limestone walls still hold the temperature they have always held, 55 degrees in every season, the earth insulating what it surrounds from the extremes that happen at the surface. The hickory stand on the ridge above produces nuts in the fall. The terraces rebuilt and extended over 8 decades produce through 9 months of the year. The spring house runs cold and clean from the seep that has not diminished in the 100 years since anyone started paying attention to it. On Saturday mornings when the oven is fired and the starter has been fed and the first loaves are proofing on the stone shelf in the teaching kitchen, when the smell of wood smoke and fermentation and the particular warmth of a place that has been consistently used for good purposes is moving through the cave and out the entrance and down the terraces and into the cool morning air of Smoky Ridge, there is something present that has no name in the conventional vocabulary, but that everyone who has spent time in the cave knows how to recognize. It is the accumulated consequence of a single decision made in a freezing yard in November of 1934, the decision to walk north instead of lying down. And of the 10,000 decisions that followed from it, each one made by a girl, and then a woman who knew without requiring it to be confirmed by anyone that she understood what food was for. And that understanding, it was enough.